On today's World Insight, over 40 years ago, former U.S. President Jimmy Carter made the bold move to normalize relations between China and the U.S. What legacy does he leave behind? And how can students today carry on his bold vision of international cooperation?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Liu Yawei. A National Day of Mourning takes place in the U.S. on Thursday to commemorate former U.S. President Jimmy Carter.
Funeral services fit for a president. The nation remembering the life and service of its 39th president, Jimmy Carter. Today's funeral service at the National Cathedral in Washington is its 6th presidential state funeral, bringing together 5 living presidents: Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump. Today's service capping off days of pomp and circumstance in D.C. for Carter's passing, with ceremonies at Joint Base Andrews, the U.S. Navy Memorial, and in a remarkable homage, the procession, following the same route Carter and his family walked the day of his inauguration in 1977, before his service in the Capitol Rotunda.
Liu Yawei, senior advisor on China at the Carter Center, worked with President Carter. He told me how the president has always been a promoter of educational exchanges between China and the U.S. and his relentless effort to make it happen. Let's take a look at my latest interview with him. Mr. Liu, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us.
No problem.
You and President Carter have enjoyed about more than 2 decades working relationship. But I understand that your feelings toward him is much more complicated than just co-workers. Tell us more about what do you remember him as a person?
Well, I first got to know President Carter when he announced the decision to normalize the relationship with China. You know, I watched that, and particularly Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping's visit to the United States in late January in 1979. At the time, of course, it was beyond my imagination that the two countries could normalize relationship. But 20 years after that date, on September the 1st, 1998, I started working for him at the Carter Center. So had it not been for his decision to normalize the relationship, I would not have been able to get the opportunity to study at Emory University in Atlanta, where Professor Carter was tenured at the age of 90s, but he became a distinguished professor shortly after he left the White House in 1981. So there is this connection that as a Chinese, I was able to come because of his decision, but also because of that decision, I went to the same university where he was the professor, and through the study over there, through a professor at the university, I got the fortune to work for him. That began in 1998.
He also later taught in the university, Emory University, and including his last appearance in a class in which you also were there. Tell us more about that and how he interacted with the younger generation. I mean, 80 years younger than he was at the time.
Yeah, President Carter became a distinguished professor at Emory University shortly after he left the White House. The only obligation as a professor to Emory University is, he was going to teach one class, one semester. He was going to give a talk to the freshmen of the university in the fall. He also was going to talk to all the international students once every semester. And that's how I got to meet with him when I was a student. He was giving a talk to Emory international students. There is someone at the Carter Center who made all the arrangement of President Carter's teaching at Emory University. So I went to him. I said, I'm teaching a Chinese foreign policy class. Could President Carter come and teach in my class? And lo and behold, in February 2018, he came to my class. We all know he was diagnosed with cancer in 2015. So this is 3 years after he was diagnosed with cancer. He continued to teach classes. He continued to teach Sunday school at his church, and he continued to get involved in everything we do. The China program was involved on U.S.-China relations. We asked him to write letters. We asked him to send greetings, and each and every time he obliged. Anything we asked him, as long as it is related to meeting with Chinese ambassador, Chinese consul general, or greeting, people from CPAFFC, the Friendship Association, or any other dignitaries from China, President Carter was more than happy to meet with them. Obviously, he was very glad to come to my class and talk about the decision about normalizing U.S.-China relationship. Each and every time he traveled to China, he always told us, make sure there's going to be a speech to university students, because he sees young people as the future for both countries, and also as people eventually that will be responsible in managing this very volatile bilateral relationship.
He has been working very hard to support young people from both sides to learn about each other's cultures and also to study in each other's countries. Even during the very late stage of his life, I remember you wrote an article earlier mentioning about his trying to talk to the White House and the administration then to provide convenience to Chinese students and their visa procedures. Tell us more about that.
I still remember that phone call. I remember the date as January the 5th, 2021. So Biden was elected, but Trump was still in the White House. We were at a virtual meeting because this was during pandemic, and his office then called on myself saying, President Carter wanted to talk to you. I was very much surprised because he was not in good health at that time. So he then, we were connected. He asked, do you know anyone in the incoming Biden administration? I said, of course, I don't know anyone, but what do you want us to do? He said, I want him to start issuing visas to the Chinese students. And I told him, I said, President Carter, the best thing to get this word to the Biden administration is for you, as someone who is so much involved in the Democratic Party, who had such a old connection and friendship, long-term friendship with President-elect Biden. It's best for you to reach out to him directly. Then he said, why don't you draft a letter? I will send a letter to President Biden. If I remember correctly, the letter was drafted, approved. Of course, President Carter, before any letter goes out, there will be a lot of revisions to the language of the letter. It was revised, it was approved. He signed the letter. Of all my years working at the Carter Center, no such letter was able to go out within 24 hours. And this letter was completed within 24 hours. And our new CEO, Paige Alexander, happened to know Tony Blinken. So she volunteered to get the letter to Tony Blinken, who soon became Secretary of State. So I always say, we don't know exactly what happened after Biden and his team received the letter, but I'm pretty sure this letter had a lot to do with Biden lifting the ban on not issuing visas to foreign students.
Do you think many of the young people who got the opportunities from both sides to study in each other's country and learn about each other's cultures really understand the contributions and efforts made by these unsung heroes, President Carter certainly included?
No, President Carter was not an unsung hero. Many of us here in the U.S. and in China, they are very familiar with the so-called the 3 o'clock, call. That's President Carter's science advisor. While he was visiting China, he was having a discussion with Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping said, "I wanted the U.S. government to accept 5,000 Chinese students and scholars." And his science advisor felt this was a very important issue. He couldn't easily give a yes or no to Deng Xiaoping. So he decided to make a call. And of course, because of the time difference, President Carter's phone rang at 3 o'clock in the morning. And President Carter liked to say that, he felt there might be a national emergency or a crisis. He picked up the call, and then he heard what his science advisor wanted to know. In his own words, he said, ask him to send 10,000 students, and he hung up the phone. So President Carter really, at the very beginning, encouraged educational exchange, particularly higher educational exchange between the two countries. And he liked to claim that credit. I think, he is in the perfect position to claim that credit.
How would you describe, from your perspective and observations, the complex relations President Carter feels about China and the Chinese people?
I think President Carter had a very special relationship with Deng Xiaoping. Obviously, Deng Xiaoping visited the U.S. And by the way, this was the last country Deng Xiaoping visited during his lifetime. This was, the 9 days that changed the whole world. He oftentimes told us that after he left the White House, Deng Xiaoping invited him to visit China. He also said Deng Xiaoping would meet with him each and every time he went to China. Deng Xiaoping also told him, if there's any issue you want to call my attention to, please call me directly. So President Carter's relationship with his counterpart at the time was very close and lasted a very long time. President Carter was not able to visit China while he was in the White House, but China was one of the first countries he visited after he left the White House. He traveled to a lot of cities and rural areas in China. Because of this early travel, after I started working in China, he was able to compare the China in the early 1980s to China in the late 1990s, but more so after the first 10 years in the 21st century. President Carter's last trip to China was in September 2014. So I started accompanying President Carter, traveling with the President Carter to China in 2001 was the first trip. I accompanied him. I was also with him the last trip. And one thing he likes to say is that I'm the witness of all the achievements, of all the freedom of traveling, freedom of moving from the rural areas to the urban areas in China. I witnessed how China was able to enrich themselves, how China was able to become from a relatively poor country to the second largest economy in the world. He, again, I think, like claiming credit for the ability of the Chinese and American students to study at each other's country, he never directly claimed the credit that China's reform, the accomplishment was also at least, if not the direct outcome, an indirect consequence of normalization between the two countries. But I think he indirectly mentioned or implied that the fact that China was where it was, it had a lot to do with peaceful coexistence between the two countries.
President Carter was actually facing a lot of controversies when he decided decisively, when serving as the president in the White House, to normalize relations with China. And also, as you just suggested, Yawei, on the issue of one China. Both the mainland and Taiwan belongs to one China. So how did he articulate the moments when he had to make those decisions? And how did he reflect back on those moments later in life?
I think early on, when he decided that it is time to normalize relationship, when he gave the instruction, the order to Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, at the time, I think the top priority probably was geopolitical. That is, the Cold War was still ongoing. It really, if U.S. can become a partner or China become a partner of the U.S., then that will significantly weaken the position of the Soviet Union. But we also need to remember that President Carter, long before, as a president, looking at national security of the U.S., looking at the Cold War, he was very much aware of China. He traveled to China in 1949 toward the end of the Civil War. He had an uncle who was in the U.S. Merchant Marine, who was posted in China many, many years ago. So when he was a kid, he received many letters from his uncle, Gordon. And he contributed to the Baptist church. Every Sunday, he went to church because he said, my money would go with the missionaries to China to help with Chinese education, with healthcare. So there is this both, his love of a country as well as the geopolitical concern. So that, I think, is a good explanation of why he felt this is an urgent task. Although at the time, people warned him, if you're going to do this, you are going to sacrifice a lot of your capital. You're going to lose in the upcoming presidential election. If we remember, what happened after normalization communique was issued, Ronald Reagan traveled to Taiwan and basically said, if elected, he was going to break up with China. Barry Goldwater, the senator from Arizona, even filed a lawsuit saying President Carter, it was unconstitutional for President Carter to make that decision. The court, should actually nullify such a decision. He did pay a very heavy political price, like his decisions to return the Panama Canal to the Panamanians themselves, as well as his decision to get Sadat and Begin into Camp David to negotiate the Camp David Accord. So President Carter was a leader. Once he believed what he was doing was correct, then he was going to act with haste. He was not going to wait. He doesn't like political convenience, so to speak.
Now, Yawei, since then, the normalization of diplomatic relations between China and the United States, there were great times, there were also worrying times, and even today, and especially today. How do you think, given your observations of President Carter, of his digesting the ups and downs of this relationship?
President Carter traveled to China, as I mentioned earlier, last time, September 2014. His last involvement on U.S.-China relationship, if I remember correctly, was a letter he wrote to the famous meeting called 读懂中国, Understanding China, that was held in December 2021. The Carter Center was a co-organizer. President Carter wrote a letter, and one of the op-ed President Carter wrote was published by Washington Post on the last day of 2018, on the eve of the 40th anniversary of U.S.-China normalization. In that op-ed, he basically said, this was a beginning of a new Cold War. Everything had to be done to stop this new Cold War from happening, and he offered a lot of recommendations in terms of how to do that. And what we do at the Carter Center, we have been doing since 2012, is actually to follow his recommendations, to find areas of possible cooperation between the U.S. and China.
I remember his last interview, big interview, and during his last trip to China back in 2014, I was very honored to be able to interview him, President Carter, then. And I remember very clearly he talked about the potential of Cold War and the lack of understanding among some in the United States, for example, about China's potential and also the pride that China has at the time. I really wonder, how did you reflect back during those days and even earlier times when he picked up pieces of what's going on in the world between China and the United States, for example, and try to understand the dramatic changes that are likely to take place between these two countries?
I think if you look at what happened, so in 2009, when President Carter traveled to China to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the normalization, Kissinger was there, Brzezinski was there, all the live ambassadors and consul generals from the U.S., they were all in China. They were celebrating, this enormous achievement. This is in 2009. By 2014, President Carter traveled to China to commemorate the 35th anniversary of the relationship. This obviously was in China. Wherever he traveled, I think he was very thrilled and excited and heartened when people approach him, local government officials, university students, experts, like Wang Bomi and He Di, who told him that you made such a huge difference. I remember when he was in Jinan, the mayor of Jinan asked President Carter to go to the window. President Carter didn't know why he should go to the window. So when President Carter got to the window, the fireworks were started. Basically, they say, we celebrate your birthday because that was at the 90th birthday, President Carter, upcoming 90th birthday. He was very touched and moved. President Carter is being consistent in believing the decision he made was a good decision.
Right.
It was for the goodness of both the U.S. and China, and also for the betterment, improvement of living conditions for the people of the whole world. He never regretted that. And so I'd like to tell people the fact that he was so reluctant to give up is because he cares about the eradication of worms. He also cares deeply about the uncertainty and instability of the relationship. He probably likes to live until the day when he could say, this relationship is stabilized, that U.S. and China, there is little chance of two countries, getting into a conflict.
Yeah. If there were opportunities that you could meet President Carter again, what would you say to him? Or at this very special moment, is there anything you want to say to President Carter?
Well, what I want to say to President Carter, if I get the opportunity, to speak to him again, is I will thank him in person, saying, had it not been for your decision back in December 1978, I would not have the opportunity to come to study in the U.S. I would not have the good fortune of working for you for over a quarter of a century. Secondly, I would tell President Carter that of all Americans, you're the one that me, my wife, our daughters admire the most because you're so down to earth. You're so unpretentious. You sacrifice, you give all you have in order to alleviate the misery of the poor people in the global south. There are very few people in this world that can match your sincerity, your dedication, your care for the people. And lastly, I would say, people in China, they are very appreciative of what you have done for China. It's fate that you were born on the same day of the founding of the People's Republic of China. He likes to say, I have the fortune of having the largest number of people under the sun to celebrate my birthday.
Thank you so much, Yawei, for sharing your precious time and also precious stories with President Carter. Really appreciate it. That is my latest interview with Liu Yawei from the Carter Center about the legacy of President Carter. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for being with us.